federalism. You may recall this concept from 8th grade. I certainly do. I think about it a lot when I'm pondering why our federal government is sort of stomping its boots on our necks on a repeated basis, day in and day out. I get kind of tired of it. And I was thinking about federalism as a concept. And I remember back when I was, I think, in 7th or 8th grade, learning about this concept. And when I went on to Google to try to find an image to prepare for the show today, I stumbled across Mr. Tinkman's 8th grade class. In fact, he has a lot of his materials right on the internet. And so if you want to take a look at what he's got here on his, it looks like he set up a little bit of a wiki here, and it's available, it's open to the public. In chapters 4 to 6, we're talking about a new constitution. This is coming out of chapters 1 to 3, colonies and the revolution, before we get to westward as the colonials moved westbound. So all that good 8th grade stuff, but something that is important here, and by the way, I don't see any critical race theory here. Pretty good job there, Mr. Tinkman. But we've got a quick understanding of how our federal government works, hearkening back to the days of 8th grade. So Americans live under a national and state government. Remember this, we talk about a dual system, federal government, state governments. And we really have kind of other systems. We've got local systems, county systems, individual cities, sort of different tiers and layers of government. Well, when we talk about the two big ones, our states and our federal government, you may recall from 8th grade that the national government is entitled to certain things. They do certain things. They maintain the military. They declare war. They run the postal system. They set standards, weights, and measures, and they protect copyrights and patents. It's kind of a limited list over there, right? Now, the states are supposed to, of course, establish local governments, set up schools, regulate state commerce, make regulations for marriage, and regulate corporations. And there are some powers that overlap, so we can share things. We can collect taxes. We got state and income tax, federal and state tax, establish courts. We got federal courts and state courts, regulate interstate commerce, right? So between states, we've got regulating banks. We can borrow money. We can provide for the general welfare. We can punish criminals. Okay, so a lot of stuff is going on here. Now, you'll know that if you're connected to American reality today, that kind of the national government kind of does all of this, right? They sort of, kind of really run the local governments by making sure that they comport with their federal regulations by promising them money or taking the money away. They set up schools. We've got the Federal Department of Education, regulate state commerce. Now, it's supposed to be interstate commerce, but the Supreme Court has basically expanded that commerce clause to include anything, including in-state commerce, if it goes out of state. Okay, so you might be saying, well, I have a factory here in Arizona and I make a bunch of widgets. So what does the federal government have the right to tell me, how I manage my widget factory? And the Supreme Court has said, well, if you sell your widgets interstate, we can regulate intra-state. So that's nice. So they sort of taken that over too. Make regulations for marriage. Of course, we know the Supreme Court kind of came out, they're still, in that space. Certainly, we're waiting on what the feds say about all of that. And of course, they definitely regulate established corporations. We've got, SEC and all these different organizations. So they kind of do a lot of everything now. And the big question that often comes up is, what happens when there's this interface between the two? What happens when you're over in this box here, when you're a state power, let's say like Missouri, and you say, this is a power that's exclusively to us. Okay, we're going to handle, for example, our gun rights in Missouri without anybody interfering with our business. And the national powers, they say, no, well, this is our power. And so we're going to come over here and we're just going to take that from you. And so you have this conflict. We're fighting in this area here about who can do what. And in Missouri, we're talking about gun rights. We've heard a lot about this from the Biden administration, from Merrick Garland. We're hearing all over the place. It's like vomiting every day about domestic violent extremism and domestic terrorism. Now, we talked about a 32-page report, and they're talking about gun violence and lone wolf and individual gunmen. But then at the same time, these militia groups and these white supremacists that apparently are the huge problem in America today, that nobody ever knows what they're doing or can't infiltrate them and can't even stop a couple people orchestrating the Capitol Hill stuff. We have 18 intelligence agencies. They can't even take care of something as basic as that. But I digress. So now we're having a conflict. Missouri is coming through. They're trying to establish their boundaries. It's our state. It's the Second Amendment. We're going to enforce it. So they pass a bill. We talked about this earlier today. Earlier this week, Governor Mike Parson came out, and he says, he's a law enforcement guy, says, throughout my law enforcement career, I have and I will always stand for the Second Amendment rights, signs HB 85 into law. This is called the Second Amendment Preservation Act in Missouri. And what does this do? If you recall, right, he signed this at a gun range up here, the range check-in and firearms rentals. So gets this signed into law, says HB 85 draws a line in the sand, says we are going to reject any attempt by the federal government to circumvent our fundamental right that the Missourians have to keep and bear arms to protect themselves and their property, right? That's a big statement. Don't even try, feds. HB 85 puts those in DC on notice that here in our state, we support responsible, law-abiding gun owners. We oppose government overreach and any unlawful efforts that limit our access to the firearms. So, my friends, this sounds like somebody who's mouthing off to the feds. They don't like when you do that. In fact, they don't like it so much, they're going to write a very upset letter about it. We're going to see if it goes further than that. Oftentimes it does, but let's take a look at what's happening here. Now we have the Justice Department sending a letter that says, Missouri, you cannot just disregard our federal gun laws. Why is my camera? Why did that? Let's see what's going on here. All right, so that's good. All right, so here's. Sometimes these slides don't work very well. All right, I'm going to read it without switching to the slide. This is a weird thing that happens sometimes with my switcher. In enforcing the Second Amendment, they said that they cannot disregard the gun laws. The federal act here says that. All right, there we go. The federal act says that infringement on a Second Amendment right shall be invalid in this state if it is an infringement. So this is the act that was just passed. It says it shall not be recognized by this state, and it's going to be specifically rejected by this state. So in his letter, Boynton lays out 5 areas of concern. So this is the letter that now is coming from the Justice Department. Let's take a look at this. It says, regarding Missouri HB 85, this is the Second Amendment Preservation Act. This letter was drafted June 16, 2021 from the U.S. Department of Justice. This is the Civil Division. They're sending it directly to the governor, okay, by electronic and U.S. mail. To the Honorable Michael L. Parson, the Honorable Eric Schmidt, Missouri Attorney General's office, and the Supreme Court building. The federal government saying, we don't like that law that you just signed. They're not talking about this. This is now HB 85. It's signed into law. Governor held that up there at the gun range. He says, I write regarding Missouri HB 85. Signed into law on Saturday. It says, by its terms, the statute appears, he says, it appears to declare numerous federal firearm laws to constitute infringements. See how I used appear there? I'm not making a claim here. It just certainly appears that way. I'm not accusing you of saying that, but it certainly appears like you're saying that. It says that it is classifying these federal laws as infringements. It says all persons enforcing laws, Missouri law, okay, it says the public safety of the people of the United States is paramount. We're concerned that, absent clarification, HB 85 threatens to imperil a long-standing and close cooperation between the feds and law enforcement agencies in Missouri. It's basically saying, hey, we want to work together at a time when homicides are up in Missouri and all of these things. Can't we just be friends? As explained below, he says, numerous provisions raise significant federal law enforcement and legal concerns. In light of significant public safety risks, we request you take action to clarify the scope of the law and respond by Friday, June 18th. That's tomorrow. Think he's going to get a response? Let's see what he wants. He wants clarification about a couple things. Let's see. He says, well, HB 85 here, it includes a number of provisions that raise concern. Of course, for us, the federal government. Not for Missouri, for the federal government. And so he said, section 1.42 says that, federal acts, laws, all this stuff, they are infringements. So if it's a tax, that's an infringement. If it's registration, that's an infringement. If you want to track ownership, that's an infringement. If you want to forbid possession, like a federal prohibition law, which they're talking about, red flag laws, all that stuff, that's an infringement. If you want to confiscate firearms, that's an infringement. And guess what? If you do that, if you recall, we talked about this, it is $50,000 per occurrence. All right, it's under Missouri law. So if some federal agent comes in there or somebody does something to infringe this, then $50,000. And I asked this when we covered this story originally, what happens if it is like they come and seize 5 guns? Is it $50,000 a pop? Get pretty expensive, $250,000 like that. Bring your collection to Missouri. Just wait for that raid. Might be a little bit of a lottery day for you. So let's continue on in the letter. He says, we've got some significant law enforcement and legal concerns here raised by HB 85. Number one, the declaration here that certain federal firearm regulations are unlawful. So that's a concern. This raises preemption concerns. Okay, preemption. And we talk about this under federal system, they say, a state cannot nullify a federal law. Remember, we talked about this, the supremacy clause. We mentioned this when we covered the story. And they go and they actually cite the Constitution. Article 6, Clause 2 says, the laws of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. And anything in the Constitution or laws of the state to the contrary notwithstanding. Which basically is saying that the U.S. laws are superior, are supreme, shall be supreme over state or anything contrary, right? It's a supremacy clause. We talk about it. So anything that interferes with that, they're saying is unjustified. So section 1.42 declares 5 categories of valid firearm regulations that are unlawful. We just went through them. They're not happy about that. Section 1.450, the prohibition on enforcing federal law. So in the Missouri law, it says no entity or person shall have the authority to enforce any federal acts, laws, or executive orders. Wow. So he's saying if this were to, apply to federal officers, then this section would violate the doctrine of intergovernmental immunity, right? So the feds have immunity when they come in and enforce the law. So here, Missouri is saying, no, you don't. Not on this issue, you don't. And the feds are responding and saying, yes, we do. We have immunity. If we want to come in there and enforce federal laws, we've got U.S. case law, which prohibits the states from regulating the federal government. Okay, according to this case, Mayo versus U.S. Now he's saying we assume here, Missouri. We assume that Missouri does not intend to directly regulate federal law enforcement agencies, and instead it means to impose limits on state law enforcement. Do you think that was Missouri's intention? I don't, because you know why? Because they said it in there. They said it right here. Look, they said it here. They said, nor authority to enforce any federal acts or laws or executive orders. So when they say we assume Missouri does not intend to directly regulate federal law, well, we know that they don't mean that, right? So he's doing the nice guy thing again. You certainly wouldn't try to regulate the feds there, were you? Would you? No? All right, here we go. Section 3, restriction on state agencies cooperating with federal firearms law enforcement. Section 4, limits on hiring former federal officers, interferes with federal grand juries. So they say this is going to impose another significant liability, $50,000, on any individual who worked for the feds, who acted in coordination with the feds, and who is forced to fall within federal firearm regulations. They say on its face, the provision therefore appears to discriminate against local federal law enforcement officials. Missouri is so unhappy with the feds, which is just a lot of fun. Okay, let's see what else we have. Clarifying the effective date. So, they got a lot of clarification that they need. We're going to see what Missouri has to say about this. Absolutely just a lot of fun. We've got HB 85 states that the law shall be in full force and effect upon its approval. So like now, but they don't know what that means, because it says we've got some other provisions that say, after August 28, 2021. So clarify for us. Absent clarity on this score, we have concerns that important law enforcement efforts could be chilled. Yeah, because if the feds are going to get popped with a $50,000 fee from the state of Missouri, charged with some sort of violation of this HB 85 law, That can add up pretty quickly. And now ordinarily you would say, well, you can't charge the feds. Like if the feds are coming in here and trying to regulate and enforce federal regulations, well, they're allowed to do that. And Missouri said, no, they're not. We don't care. It's fine. We don't care. Let's see what else. Under the Supremacy Clause, Missouri lacks the authority to nullify federal law, to shield Missouri businesses or its citizens from the reach of federal law, or to obstruct and prevent federal employees from doing all this stuff. Okay? Federal law, ATF, FBI, U.S. Marshals, U.S. Attorney's Office, and the list goes on and on. We need to do our business, right? Signed off on here by Brian Boynton, Acting Assistant Attorney General to Merrick Garland. So they want an answer tomorrow by Friday, June 18th, or they can contact him if they want some further information. You know, it's always fun when they want to enforce federal law when it sort of is their issue. Okay, in this situation, for example, it's about gun control. But what happens if we're talking about maybe illegal immigration? Then we hear the argument that Feds should stay out of it, right? If individual cities want to be sanctuary cities, they're entitled to do that. It's their own business. Let the Feds stay out of it. And we have many sanctuary cities all around this country, don't we? California has, I think, a lot of them. And there may be good reason for that, or it may be a good policy decision, but in this case, they don't want you to allow your local government to run things. In other cases, they're perfectly okay with that. Very convenient. All right, so let's go over to reason.com. Oh, no, let's finish this article here. It says this bill was the focus of the Republican leadership there in Missouri. The measure saw extensive pushback from the other side of the aisle. Democrats said it is a defund the police measure, which would encourage fringe groups. So we talked about most of this last time. So the question that I had that I wanted to sort of frame out for you here was, what was this concept, right? Because the federal government, legally speaking, is accurate, right? The Supremacy Clause exists. The Constitution's pretty clear about that. And the United States Supreme Court has confirmed that. And this was actually done for good reason. If you go back historically speaking about the sort of the birth of America, you may recall that we had the Articles of Confederation. That was our first attempt at sort of organizing the 13 colonies, or the founders then were trying to do that. And it was just a little bit too loose, right? The different states or colonies at the time were having trouble organizing an army and generating enough revenue, and it was all just sort of a little bit too discombobulated. So they sort of scrapped the Articles of Confederation, brought in the U.S. Constitution, revisited that, constitutional conventions, and sort of rethought the whole thing with giving a little bit more power to the federal government, maintaining that duality, that system of federalism where the feds are at the top, the states have a lot of rights, and the Constitution, via the 10th Amendment, is going to reserve them a ton of rights, because there was this debate happening about, whether the federal government should be more powerful or less powerful, because all of these people had just come over from, the old world where they were kind of sick and tired of the bureaucratic, overly burdensome, no taxation without representation version of government that they had. So, thankfully, we do have a couple layers of government, and we have the ability now to sort of, have competing jurisdictions over things, which is a beautiful concept. The idea that maybe we have competing jurisdictions that you can push back against each other. You can pick up and move. If you don't like the gun laws in California, get up and go to Missouri. They got some pretty dang good ones there, it sounds like. So, you can actually just do that, which is a beautiful thing here. And I'd like to see actually more of that, which is why on this show regularly, I talk about local. Okay, who cares what they're doing in Washington, D.C. if you're on your school board mandating, what's happening to your kids in your community? Different conversation there. So I want to show you now this interplay. So this is an article over from Reason that's talking about nullification. Okay, the federal government can do whatever they want, but they have an issue when it comes down to enforceability, which has sort of been the theme here of the show today. So let's go over here and let me show you what I'm talking about. Enforceability. We have this situation now where Merrick Garland's Department of Justice is sending letters over to Missouri, a state that has done something that it says is in close adherence to the federal Constitution, protecting the Second Amendment. Merrick Garland not happy about that. The Justice Department, Biden administration not happy about it. Okay, if they're legally right, if the supremacy clause exists, if all of this in the court of law would actually go in their favor, the next question is, so what? And it comes to enforceability. What are they going to do about it? Let's take a look. Let's see what Reason has to say. According to this article written by John Osterhout, good article. I would encourage you to go read the whole thing. That's the title. Plug that into Google and you can find it. It says that more than a dozen states are trying to nullify federal gun control. Now, this article is actually not recent. It was back on, April and of this year, so somewhat recent. Conservative state legislators, this article says, are taking a page from the playbook of pro-immigration activists and marijuana legalization movements. Okay, I talked about this previously. Marijuana legalization is another good one. Federal government says you cannot do that. It is illegal federally. States around the country just say, well, we don't care. So what? We're going to pass it anyways. Arizona just was one of the more recent ones to join the fray. And what are the feds going to do about it? We'll see. So back here it says defying the federal law is something that a majority of the states already do when it comes to marijuana. In terms of the method, it's identical, says Sabatini. In sanctuary cities, they stop reporting or dealing with ICE. It's basically what we're doing. He says that if states refuse to cooperate with ATF, then federal gun control becomes difficult to enforce. ATF only has about 5,500 employees for the whole country. About a third of them are in the administration or in administration. It means they don't have the manpower or the resources to enforce federal gun control in their own. Maximum capacity, he says, a year in, year out, 8,000, 10,000 closed cases. So if you get a combination of more than 10,000 people violating a federal act, and then on top of that, you have states and local communities refusing to participate in enforcement, you've then opened the door to actually nullify that federal act in practice and effect. States are doing it across the board. Missouri is another one, another domino that just fell. We've got Bolden here says that the case for nullification doesn't depend on the constitutionality of a law, because we're talking about a legal doctrine known as anti-commandeering. They say it's been upheld in 5 Supreme Court cases. 1842 to 2018, so a recent case, holds that the federal government can't require states and localities to participate in the enforcement of federal laws. Okay, so the feds, in other words, can pass whatever they want, but states don't have to enforce them at all. Now, Missouri goes a little bit further in that, right? Because they're saying not only are we not going to enforce that or recognize those, but if you come in, federal government, we're going to ding you with a $50,000 fine. Okay, that might be something that gets tossed out of that bill or of that law. I don't know, though. We'll see. Talking about constitutionality does kind of get in the way of anti-commandeering. Says a lot of people like to think of that as a line in the sand. I think that's a good approach, but I don't think that they should be helping enforce federal gun control, even if a federal court says this federal gun measure is constitutional. Okay, now there's another, Bolden is talking about the allegation. There's an allegation here that, let me skip over that. Anti-commandeering, just to give you a history on this, originated back in 1842. So anti-commandeering is the idea that the government cannot mandate that states adhere to federal laws. Let's go back to 1842. Supreme Court case, Prigg versus Pennsylvania. This upheld a state's right not to participate in enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. Bottom line is nullification as a tool. Banning participation in federal enforcement was actually a tool of the anti-slavery abolitionist North. When South Carolina seceded, they issued a document to explain their rationale, and specifically, they said that Northern nullification of the federal Fugitive Slave Act. Okay, when South Carolina left the country, when they seceded to join the Confederacy, they issued a document. They said, hey, we're leaving because the northern states nullified the Fugitive Slave Act. So back in the 1840s, there was a federal law that said if a slave runs away, you got to return him back. If a slave flees through the Underground Railroad, works their way north, and lands in a northern state that doesn't have slave laws, the federal law said, you got to send them back. Okay, that person is property. They belong to somebody down there. Ship them back down there. Give them back down south. And northern states said, we're not doing that. No way. What are you, whacked? They were not sending anybody anywhere. So South Carolina then says, well, we're not happy about this. Okay, the Fugitive Slave Act, nobody's following the law here anymore. Northerners are nullifying this federal law because the feds are tyrannical idiots, and we're not going to allow this to happen anymore. And that was the beginning of the Civil War, which was needed and resulted in, you know, a lot of pain and suffering and hardship in the country on every single part of the conflict. But America got through it, and here we are today having still difficult conversations about race in America. Isn't that great? So let's take a look at some questions over from Joe Snow. Says, you forgot to mention infringing on gun rights under the federal government's responsibilities. That's a good point. Yeah, I forgot the infringement slide. I have let's say federal government infringements. I don't think I have enough slide. I don't have enough hard drive space for a presentation that big. We've got Jeremy Matrita says, I watched the law enforcement interaction training last night. Was very impressed with the content. Says, you're absolutely right in saying it's better to have and not need than to need and not have. While watching, I did have some questions. I would have been able to attend. You never cease to amaze me in all the different content you were creating and establishing. Well, that's very nice, Jeremy. That's very nice of you. What a nice thing to say. Well, I do appreciate that. You know, sometimes it feels like I'm not doing enough. So it's hard for that to resonate. You know, I have so much that I want to get out, and it just sometimes feels like I could be doing more. So thank you for telling me that you're pleased with the current level of production. I'm still going to try to pick it up anyways. But it was a lot of fun. We had a good time on that episode. Or it wasn't an episode. It was a 2.5-hour workshop, and we had some great questions. I think it was about an hour and a half of content, more or less. Again, it's the 3 rules. The one rule that is only this rule. 2 questions, 3 responses. 2 questions, 3 responses. Go check that out at my Gumroad. Link down in the description below. We've got Furby Slayers in the house. Says it's time for the states to stand up and demand the Constitution be observed. Millions do not agree with the current interpretation of the Second Amendment. I fear that SCOTUS won't stand up for us. Well, SCOTUS is, you know, I'm not sure that gun rights are really on the ropes. I know that it's a very popular thing to talk about right now. I know the Democrats make heyday about this. You know, it was Beto's thing for a long time after the shooting in Texas. You know, that was his whole platform. But then the pandemic happened. And then we saw social unrest in various parts of the country, even here in Arizona and many other places. And so people started to realize, oh, you know what? The government is kind of useless in many ways. And so maybe it's a good idea for me to arm myself up. Ammo has been flying off the shelves. Guns are out of stock all over the place. You know, the whole thing is not popular anymore. You might have a lot of people who say, well, I'm for gun control, but I still want a gun. And so, you know, maybe they'll tell you that publicly. They'll post on the poll that gun violence is America's biggest problem. But when it comes to protecting themselves, they'll happily go get one. All right, we got Nadarb says, your AG is telling the feds to mind their business too, isn't he? Dealing with the audit. That's right, he is. So Merrick Garland then did his little finger wagging BS in our faces too. He said, oh, you auditors down there, you're doing some bad stuff. You better stop that right now. And Mark Brnovich fired off back to him and said, what, buddy boy? Excuse me? Which is great. I would love to see more attorney generals just thumb their noses up at the feds, because what the heck, you know, it's our business. We run our elections how we want to run them. And the Supreme Court said that. Do you know how we know that? Because they said that Pennsylvania can do whatever the hell they want to do too. If they want to move the things, the deadlines around, if they want to, you know, waive signature verification, if they want to just, you know, do whatever, chuck their ballots around wherever they want to put them, they're free to do that. Supreme Court said so. So if Arizona wants to audit our cases, damn it, we're going to do so, and you better stay out of it. So we'll see how that works out. But I'm looking forward to a lot more of these conversations. We've got Edon Tess here says, when it comes to abortion and when life becomes a life is an issue that is not going to be settled in law. This is an issue where humans will have to come to grips that we have the power to create life. Be that a God-given ability comes from the unknowable universe or something that comes from the process of evolution. We have the power to create life, and we have to come to grips that there is a responsibility with that ability. Props to Joe Snow, who is making this case on the locals group. Yeah, you know, I think you're right about that. You know, there are some things that are outside of the purview of the law. And, you know, this is an existential question. And there's probably not going to be an answer that all of humanity is going to settle upon. So I think when it comes to these issues, you know, the idea is you create a framework that gives people the maximum amount of freedom and you give society the maximum amount of benefit. I mean, those are sort of my my guiding principles. And I don't really, have a stake in this fight, but I understand the sort of the legal framework, and I have concerns that the legal framework of Roe versus Wade is going to be something that sort of justifies other bad law down the road that will go into my professional area, right? I'm not a family law attorney or a child development person or anything like that, but this is an issue that has been at the forefront of the legal mind of the country for ever. I mean, for as long as I've been alive, since the 1970s, we've been talking about this. And so this is going to be a big deal when it does come down the pike. And of course, well, we're going to try to take all of the different arguments and, lay them out without getting too volatile. Abortion's one of those issues, man. It's like people go from 0 to 1,000 like instantly. It's like, gosh, all right, let's all relax a little bit. Like, can we just talk about these things? Which is why I just want to I just want to kind of scoot on by it if we can. But I know we're not going to be able to do that. And I don't want to do that, really. I'm just joking. Okay, let's go next. We got Want to Know. It says, Oregon has constitutional carry. Counties and cities have passed laws that say you can't openly carry and allowed to do that. They did it. Yeah. So, right. So you can overly regulate guns, but you can't sort of double down on the defense of your privilege protected under the Constitution. We have the Veil says, so if Missouri can charge the feds $50,000 per violation, then the border states can charge $1.5 million per immigrant illegally crossing the border. This will not only make the states rich, we can finish the border wall. I think it's absolutely needed. Then charge each federal institution who failed to come to the border state's aid. Yeah, that's what our dual system is about. You have all of these different checks and balances. And one check is that the states can just, hey, no, look, we're going to reassert our rights in the face of a tyrannical federal government. It's built into the system. It's why it is the way that it is. And I think that it's nice to see some states doing that. All right, we've got last up on this segment says, how do the sanctuary cities for illegals come into play with Missouri basically being a sanctuary state for the Second Amendment? Yeah, so it is a very similar argument, right? It again comes down to enforceability. And then, of course, what happens? So enforceability being, it's up to the states to enforce state laws, but they have no obligation to enforce federal laws. So in the case of, let's say, the Second Amendment, the U.S. Justice Department now currently is saying, well, we're going to make some enforcement decisions as it relates to firearms. Okay, this happens all the time. Just because a law is on the books doesn't necessarily mean it is enforced, right? Prosecutions take place based on charging decisions. A prosecutor can look at one case and say, well, that warrants criminal charges, and something that's very similar doesn't, because of certain situational factors that may or may not exist. So when you have a new administration come in, they adjust their prosecutorial priorities. They say, well, it's a new guard in town. We suddenly don't care about those cases, but we care about these cases because it's a political maneuver. And so what's happening here, right, is certain demographics are being, let's say, favored, or certain policies that favor certain demographics are not being enforced, is a better way to put it. That immigration policies that are in favored cities are not being enforced on a federal level. This is called sanctuary cities, and this is largely being done because the sanctuary cities and states are nullifying the feds. They're just saying, no, we're not going to communicate with ICE. We have no reason to do that. So if you're going to be if you're on the side that favors that, then you should also favor Missouri doing that, right? Because they're also exercising state rights. If you think that Missouri is problematic, well, then theoretically you have an issue with nullification. You would also have an issue with sanctuary city nullifications. Now, people will sort of split that argument if they can, and they'll say that one is about humanity, right? Being humanitarian in the case of sanctuary cities, whereas somebody who is in opposition to gun control is a gun nut, monster, conspiracy theorist, white supremacist, xenophobe, bigot, whatever. So we all know how that goes. So, all right, one more plug here for the R&R Law Group. This is our law firm in Scottsdale. We talk a lot of stuff on this channel, but at our law firm, we have boots on the ground. We have a whole team of people who are dedicated to helping good people facing criminal charges to find safety, clarity, and hope. Our phone number is right down here, 480-787-0394. Very much appreciate if you know anybody in our state that needs help with a criminal charge. We would love the opportunity to help. And if you're looking for some information about how to deal with law enforcement to prevent ever being charged with the crime, check out this law enforcement interaction training, now available at gumroad.com/Robert Grueller. And we thank you for all of your support.